This prediction video was written, recorded, and edited before the Pokemon leaks. That being said, none of the Pokemon leaks for future projects will be involved in any of my videos, including this one. Furthermore, if you mention any future Pokemon projects that have been leaked in my comments, your comments will be removed and you will not be able to comment on my channel. Talking about leaks of past projects is one thing. We don't talk spoilers here. At this point in the life cycle of a Pokemon game, most people are talking about their predictions for the next one in the series, and all eyes are on Pokemon Legends ZA, since it's the next game to come out for the franchise. Actually, my second Pokemon video on this channel was a Legends ZA prediction, and I feel pretty good about it. But right now, I kind of want to look forward. Actually, even more forward. After Pokemon Legends ZA will be the 10th Pokemon generation to come out, and that is too tantalizing a prediction to pass up, especially when we know nothing about it. So anything I say, if it's true, will seem even cooler. So what will we see for the 10th generation of Pokemon? Well, let's find out. Something that needs to be taken into account for a question like this is how long we have to wait for that game. I feel like it's common knowledge that Pokemon makes way too many games way too quickly. If you count remakes, there has never been more than 2 years without a mainline Pokemon game, and it's often barely 1 year between games. This has worked in the past when the games were smaller and on less powerful devices, but as the games get bigger and bigger and release on stronger and stronger hardware, the fans have rightfully criticized Pokemon Company for this practice, citing seemingly rushed games and buggy releases. Not to mention the horrible crunch time the developers have to suffer under just to make this sort of a timeline work. And look, I get it. Pokemon is a whole franchise with card games and toys and anime to keep up with, and those products need new content to make things about, and the games really drive that new content. But luckily, it seems like Pokemon Company is finally taking a breather and giving its games some time to cook. Scarlet and Violet came out in 2022. Yeah, it might not seem that long ago, but this game is 2 years old, and Pokemon Legends ZA isn't coming out until next year. So already, a 3-year gap is the longest mainline Pokemon game gap in history. So if we're lucky, then the 10th generation might even take an extra year or two after that. Keep in mind that these games are developed by separate teams within the company. So it's not like they work on ZA and then begin working on the next game. From previous interviews, it seems like they're already working on the next game even before the first game comes out. But if the 10th generation of Pokemon comes out in 2026 or even 2027, that would be crazy to think about and wildly unprecedented. That would be a 5-year gap between Generation 9 and Generation 10. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. That just means there's a lot more time for Pokemon to really craft this game and make it something we want to see. But just for context on that gap, taking a 5-year gap from 2011 to 2016, we got Black and White, Black 2 and White 2, X and Y, Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, and Sun and Moon all within 5 years. If this timeline is true, then this would be the longest wait in Pokemon's history. And again, I promise you that is a good thing. My thoughts on most game development times are epitomized by the meme, "I want shorter games with worse graphics and I'm not kidding." Now, this is mostly for indie game studios that cannot afford these incredibly long development times. But for a company like Pokemon, aka the largest media franchise in the world, they can afford longer development times. So I don't necessarily want shorter games with worse graphics from Pokemon Company. I want better crafted games, even if that means waiting a longer time, especially if that means alleviating some of the crunch time on their development team. But then the question becomes, if they're taking this much time for the 10th generation, what can we expect? Breaking news. Locals have reported a new cryptid in the woods, supposedly summoned by a ne'er-do-well. Footages have been obtained from several witnesses reporting a small piece of toast terrorizing them in the local forest. If you would like to get one of your own, they're available now on makeship.com/product/toast-plushie. The link is in the description for further information. This plushie will be available for the next 3 weeks via pre-order. Witnesses also allege that there are 2 faces of the plushie, one that looks happy and one that looks dizzy. Do not trust this toast under any circumstances. A lot of people assume it's going to be a sort of celebration game. After all, it's the 10th generation, so that's a perfect time to celebrate the history of Pokemon so far. But by celebrate, does this mean it will be the mythical all regions Pokemon game, like many fans have wanted? Well, frankly, I hope it isn't. I've never liked the idea of an all-regions Pokemon game, mainly because of Generation 2. As cool as it was to be able to beat Johto and then walk into Kanto with your team and do a whole new set of gyms, everyone knows the level curve in Generation 2 is atrocious. Pokemon have set up such a formula that it's really hard to balance your levels in a meaningful way after 8 gyms plus an Elite Four, unless we have to switch Pokemon every region, but at that point, you might as well just make a collection game where you can play like the first 5 games all in one big game. That would be amazing, and I would love that. But keep in mind that this is going to be at least a 3-year gap from Scarlet and Violet, so at that point, there's going to need to be new content for the rest of the franchise to function. The anime and the card games and the toys all need new Pokemon sooner than later. So if we wait 3 or 5 years from Scarlet and Violet, then just get a collection game, as much as I would like that, there's going to be 2 or 3 more years until there's new Pokemon. And then the rest of the franchise has to wait upwards of 7 years for new Pokemon to talk about. So even if there is a collection game, I think it would release alongside a new game. So what would that new game be based on? When thinking about the region that a 10th Pokemon generation would take place in, as wide and interesting as our options are, I think it's incredibly likely that they would go back to Japan for this one. Like I've mentioned, a bit of a celebration makes sense for the 10th generation, and going back to where the games all began in Japan makes a lot of sense to do that. Keep in mind the first 4 regions of Pokemon were all directly based off of real-life regions of Japan. I mean, the first game's region is called Kanto, and is based off of the region the Pokemon HQ is located, which is called Kanto. But even though they've done 4 games based off of the country, Japan's a big country with a lot of various regions in it, and they haven't gotten them all. So what regions would be likely for Generation 10? Well, I have a hunch as to the general direction that this game might be going, and I think that'll inform what region it'll be based off of. Have you ever noticed there's a lot of weirdly historical and traditional stuff in the post-game of Scarlet and Violet? I mean, the post-game in the base game has us chasing legends of cursed Pokemon who ruined the ancient kingdoms and were sealed away. And the first DLC literally focuses on a small rural town celebrating their ancient traditions about a traditional legend of an ogre. The second DLC doesn't work for this theory, so pretend it doesn't exist for the next 5 minutes. Between that and the warm reception that Legends Arceus received, I wouldn't doubt if that's the sort of direction they would want to head into for the next game, almost as if they were testing the waters with the DLC to see how fans would receive it. And it works thematically. The idea of a 10th generation game celebrating the history of the franchise in a region steeped in history and tradition is a match made in heaven. So, what Japanese regions are most known for their historical landmarks and traditional celebrations? Well, this is where you're going to have to give me a little bit of leniency. I am no expert on Japanese history or culture. Frankly, I'm no expert on any culture, even in the region I live in, the US. I've done a good amount of research going into this video because I wanted to do this respectfully and thoughtfully, but research can only go so far when I spend only a few weeks looking into it, and if I take any longer, it wouldn't be sustainable to make a video on this topic. I feel like I'm pretty good at research from my college days, but if I say anything inaccurate moving forward based on real-life regions, feel free to correct me in the comments, and I apologize in advance. I want to make sure I do this respectfully and thoughtfully, but in case I get something wrong, please let me know. According to the research I've been doing, most people think of 2 specific regions when considering traditional celebrations and historical landmarks in Japan, and those are the Kansai and Tohoku regions. Well, Johto is already based off of the Kansai region, and I mean, look at Gold and Silver, they're very traditional, but Tohoku hasn't really been touched, and it would kind of be perfect for this game. In my research, it seems that Tohoku is a lesser touristed area of Japan, home to some more rural and mountainous prefectures, and steeped in traditional celebrations and folklore. Many people who do visit Tohoku do so for the beautiful mountain ranges, the fall-adjacent trees and weather, and the wonderful onsen and festival culture. All of this seems like a wonderful opportunity for Pokemon Company to celebrate a region of Japan that they have not done yet, and at the same time, celebrate their own history. It would be a wonderful change of pace for a Pokemon setting to have a more landscaped-based region. Of course, there are still cities, obviously, in Tohoku. Sendai and Akita come to mind immediately, and there's plenty more, but there's a lot of wonderful and beautiful countryside that could be really interestingly utilized in a Pokemon game. All this to say, my prediction for the next mainline Pokemon game after Legends ZA is Generation 10, a region based in Tohoku, celebrating Pokemon's history in a very traditional landscape-based region. What kind of game will it be? Probably open world again, but I've got no idea what they're going to do for the actual gameplay. But what do you think? I think this is a pretty logical and sound prediction, but it's based off of a lot of assumptions on how Pokemon wants to treat their 10th generation. After all, it could just be another generation for them. But speaking of generations, the first videos I made in this new wave are all about the best and worst Pokemon of each generation, and you can watch part 2 of that right here. But you should probably start with part 1 if you didn't see that either. Until next time, you've been watching Rye Toost. Of all the YouTube channels, it's the second one. Stay toasty, Slices.